Hello, global gardeners. Happy Monday from a cold and snowy Colorado. Go figure. We'll talk more about that here in a little bit. Have you started cleaning up your garden? Have you? Have you finished cleaning up your garden? Are you just now thinking about cleaning up your garden? In fall and spring, that's generally the seasons that we begin cleaning up our garden. That's what I want to discuss today. It's not an easy answer, and it's not necessarily a single method that's going to be suitable for all of us. I'd love to hear some of your suggestions, some of your tips, some of your philosophies about cleaning up your garden. And of course, I'll be sharing many of mine. It's great to see so many of you. Rick is saying they've got a heat wave in Sydney, Australia right now. It's the complete opposite here. Normally, for my part of Colorado, we don't get much snow in the month of November. Maybe on average, it's about an inch and a half of snow. This month, we've already got more than 20 inches of snow. So this is crazy. This is a picture of my garden this morning. There wasn't snow in the forecast. I woke up, let the dogs out, and was a bit startled by white covering the ground. This definitely affects my plan for cleaning up my garden. The weekend weather was actually pretty nice. The temperatures were about 65 degrees for me. That's about 18 Celsius. And I was able to get out, clean up some of the beds, my vegetable garden beds, and start thinking about getting ready for winter. And now I've got snow. The rest of this week is going to be cold. So my activities in the garden have essentially been shut down for this week. So when we start thinking about cleaning up the garden, for some of us who have these extreme temperatures, have a plan. Think about the things that you want to do. Think about the things you need to do. And you might not be able to do it all at once or over a period of a week or two. It might be, like me, the kind of thing that you have to squeeze in. You suddenly have a good day and you go out and do something. And then 2 weeks later, you have another good day and you go out and do something. And then maybe you've got a great week with a sequence of days put together that you can get out and do it. The idea is you've got to think about cleaning up your garden. And why? Well, start with the garden pests that you have in your garden. Many of the pests that all of us are dealing with on a regular basis overwinter. A lot of the bad bugs don't die when it gets cold. Some of them will burrow into the ground. Some of them will go dormant underneath a pile of leaves. Some of them will burrow into the stalks of dead branches and just wait out the winter. Finding the life cycle of the insects that you have to deal with the most may identify for you that cleanup in your garden can have a huge impact in the next year. Squash bugs, for instance. Squash bugs will overwinter in some of those dead plants that you leave lying on the surface of your garden beds. Clean up those garden beds, and now the squash bugs have no place to spend the winter. Or like for me, most of my bugs have already moved to whatever their winter home is going to be. Now, when I clean up some of those dead plants and throw them in the compost pile, I'm taking care of those pests for next year. They're going to be killed either by the compost pile or by me turning the compost pile, or they're going to emerge next year into the compost pile, assuming they survive. So I've eliminated those pests from my garden beds by cleaning up my garden beds. I've mentioned before my raspberry canes, how here in Colorado I have a pest, the raspberry cane borer, that actually bores into the raspberry canes to overwinter. By cutting down those raspberry canes, I'm eliminating that pest for next year. And I've found out the hard way even recently. At my last house, I had a terrible problem with those pests in my garden. And this new house was far enough away. There aren't many gardens in my neighborhood. And I thought, I will be fine. I don't need to cut the raspberry canes down. And last year, I didn't clean up that part of the garden. And what happened? I had raspberry cane borers again. So they're obviously flying through the Colorado skies looking for raspberry patches. They found mine. They laid eggs last winter so that this year, when they emerged, my canes were devastated. I had very few raspberries this year because so many of the canes that I left standing last winter died. The raspberry cane borer emerges and it destroys the whole stock. So this year, that's back on my list of things to do as I'm cleaning up my garden. I've got to cut back all of my raspberry canes so that next year I don't have a raspberry cane borer problem. So these are the kind of things that as you do more gardening, as you develop more experience, as you start seeing what works and what doesn't work, you have to build that into your plan. And often it's as simple as just cleaning up the garden. Jana says garden cleanup means more browns for the compost. Sure, absolutely. And depending on when you clean up. So I had intended on cleaning up my tomato plants and adding them as greens to the garden because when I had the first freeze, they were still green. They hadn't browned yet, but they were dead. Well, then we had an incredible snowfall a couple of weeks ago, and that cut down on my outdoor time. Now, all those tomato plants that I was going to put into the compost as green plants are brown. So, yeah, absolutely. And particularly this time of year, if any of you are doing holiday entertaining, you might have a lot of kitchen waste. I've got all the banana peels and the lettuce scraps and everything else from my normal day to day. But as I prepare holiday meals and as I do entertaining, I have more scraps. Those typically are greens, the nitrogen rich materials. So if you've added browns to your compost pile, you still have the opportunity of adding greens by just putting your normal kitchen waste out there. So I I like fall in particular as a time of year to really boost my compost, to boost the volume of material that I'm putting into my compost piles. Because if I get early enough and they're still green, great addition to the compost pile. If I have to delay and they're browns, still a great addition to the compost pile. So make that part of your plan as you are I'm back. Wasn't that exciting? I had some kind of glitch and lost my computer, and now I'm back. So hopefully you are staying with me during that time and we can continue. I'm doing a quick check to make sure everything is looking the way that it should look, and we'll get right back with the show. I apologize for that. I don't know if that, I think there was a glitch in my computer that caused something to happen because everything just suddenly shut down. And then when everything started again, of course, the computer had to do an update. So we're back and it looks like you can see me now. So this is craziness. This is what happens when you're live. Things can go wrong. So where were we? We were talking about cleaning up the garden and having part of your plan to match whatever your weather is, whatever the changes are within the garden, and then of course matching the pests that you have in your garden as well. And so I start with the pests because that's one of those things that we really can control. By cleaning up the garden waste, we can eliminate some of those pests in the following season. I also like to look at the positive aspect of it, the wildlife in our garden, because this is the other side of the coin. We're cleaning up our garden waste because we want to eliminate some of those garden pests. But some of the other things that we do to deal with the pests are the wildlife in our garden, the birds, for instance, and some of the predatory animals we might have in our landscape. They can actually benefit when you don't clean up your garden. And so think about what it is that you want in your garden, the birds, for instance, and what they need during the winter months. So all of the leaves have fallen from my trees. They're bare. The birds are obvious to any bigger predatory animals, the cats and the hawks and anything that might be hunting my birds. So during the winter months when there's no leaves on the trees, those kind of animals like birds are looking for someplace to hide. Well, in my landscape, I'm cleaning up my vegetable garden beds to eliminate the potential for some of those pests, but I'm leaving piles of twigs and branches along with some leaves because that's where some of those animals are hiding. So the garden cleanup is not necessarily a cleanup everything. It's a very strategic cleanup so that you deal with some of those things that you want to get rid of and you deal with some of those things that you want to keep. So keep that in mind as we continue the discussion as to what's good and what's bad. Boothby Gardens is asking, should I empty all my containers of soil? I've read that bad things can survive over winter. Possibly. And so this gets back to what the pest is. So if it is one of those pests that will either lay eggs in the soil or will burrow into the soil, then yeah, you might want to consider that. I tend to wait until spring for my containers. Now, my my grow bags, as I've shown in some previous videos, I'll typically dump my grow bags either in my greenhouse or I'll use some of that organic material in my raised beds. So, as I am cleaning up my garden, the vegetable garden in particular, I'm amending the soil as part of the cleanup. So the beds I worked on this weekend, I added a layer of compost, and I added some leaves and straw on top, and they're put away for the winter. That compost will eventually break down and benefit the soil. Because my soil already has enough nutrients in it, I can now just do the top dressing and kind of get into the no dig gardening method. Because for the last 5 years, I've been amending the soil, turning that compost into the soil. And so with my grow bags, all of that material, I'll just dump on top of my garden beds, just like I'm dumping compost on top of my garden beds before I add the winter mulch. But for the other containers, for my 5-gallon buckets, for my pots, I wait until spring because many of those pots still have some perennial flowers in them, maybe some annual flowers that have gone to seed. And those are the kind of things I save for the birds. So I have a whole bunch of plants that I leave up all winter long because they have seeds on them as a food source for my birds. In the spring, that's when I empty out my pots and most of my containers, because anything that would have overwintered in the soil, when I dump it out and add in new compost and revitalize the soil, any of those eggs and larvae are now going to be exposed and they're going to die off. So you can do it in fall, but I save that for spring after things warm up. I got to have something to do in spring before the weather warms up. And so as for the bad things that can survive in soil, absolutely. And that is the pest that we're trying to eliminate by doing some of that garden cleanup. It depends on the pest. So find out what's happening in your garden and see if it's a soil-borne pest, and that can help make your decision of whether you clean up your containers in the fall or if you do it in the spring. But doing that is probably a good idea if you have those kind of pests. Trolled is saying, I've chopped and dropped much and also put shredded leaves on top of my pots and planters, probably helping both pests and beneficial bugs. Yeah, you could be, but it again, it depends on the pest. And so I've gone years without turning the soil in my pots and doing the same thing, particularly the bigger pots. I just add compost and add mulch, and I don't have a big problem with those burrowing insects. And so I can get away with it. If you don't have those kind of pests, yeah, make it easy. Just add the shredded leaves on top, and that'll help protect your soil, help add nutrients to the soil, and you'll be ready to put plants in springtime. The beneficial is the same thing. Get to know the bugs in your garden and find out what the beneficial insects are seeking. And some of the beneficial insects that we have in our garden, particularly the wasps, for instance. Wasps are often seen as something we got to get rid of because they sting us. Very few wasps will actually sting you. Most of the wasps in our garden are actually taking care of those pests. So give the wasps what they need. They need cover. They may like branches. There are a lot of wasps that will overwinter in branch piles. They like moisture for your birds and for some of those insects that actually survive through the winter. Having a source of water can be very important. So getting to know what is good and what is bad in your garden can really help define what it is you're doing in your garden when it comes to taking care of the cleanup, to decide to do it or not. And there's Jay. Shout out to Jay and Heidi, both here today. I hope you're doing well, Heidi. And thank you, Jay, of course, for always keeping up with things. There's one of my videos on should you clean up your garden in fall. And so a lot of what I'm talking about today is covered in that video, but that's like a 10 or 12 minute video. And so we have a lot more time today to get a little more in depth and, of course, to answer your questions about the garden cleanup, to make sure everybody really does understand what works best for you. Because what works best for me, I like leaving up things in the garden. My grasses, for instance, the ornamental grasses look great with the snow on them, with the icicles that might form. There's seed heads on those grasses to help the birds. And the ornamental grasses are a nice clump that can offer protection for some of those beneficial insects in particular. A lot of beneficial insects will overwinter in grass. So I keep my ornamental grass up all winter, and I don't cut it back until spring when the new growth emerges. And that works best for me. If you don't like the look of grass in your landscape over the winter, then cut it down. There's no single answer to this. Dan is saying, I still need to clean up mine. I really need to do the tomato bed. Otherwise, I will have thousands of volunteer plants. Yeah, my dogs are doing a great a great job of bringing in the tomatoes that remain in my garden. But that's another good point. When we are cleaning up our garden, if you leave those tomatoes or those peppers or those squashes or anything else out there, they're going to break down in the winter and they're going to drop their seeds. And now you've got extra weeding to deal with next year as those seeds begin sprouting. Weeding is an important fall activity for almost all of us. Yeah, start with the vegetable garden as part of the cleanup, but also think about the weeds. Try to do a final weeding. Pull out those annual weeds, and you'll probably still see some of the perennial weeds in your garden. Get rid of them going into the winter. And I use them as mulch. So in my vegetable garden beds, did a great job of weeding throughout the winter or throughout the summer. But as I'm cleaning up those beds, getting ready for winter, sure, there's some weeds in those beds. So I pull those weeds, add my compost. Those weeds now become part of the mulch on top of the straw and the leaves. I just leave them all in place. It often isn't worth the effort of pulling up all those weeds and throwing them in the compost pile. If they haven't flowered and set seed, you can use weeds as a mulch. It's just another plant. If they've gone to seed, then you can make the decision of whether you're going to put them in your compost pile or discard them. But do some weeding in fall. It makes your job in spring so much easier because that's one less thing that you have to worry about. Llama Llama says, I have rounds made from fencing filled with logs around the garden. Lots of things live in those over winter, and they're like apartment complexes in the summer for the lizards. Great idea. That's a wonderful idea. I did a video a few years ago about making a bee hotel, and it's the same idea. Yeah, just stack logs of all different types and sizes and branches, and keep them in a nice secluded area of your garden that you're not going to bother. And you'd be surprised what kind of wildlife moves in. Wasps, bees will find spots like that. And then, of course, things like lizards and even rodents. And rodents aren't necessarily an overall bad thing in the garden. Mice will eat some of those little insects that will eat our plants. So while you can get a rodent infestation that could be a problem and you have to deal with it, a few rodents here and there just help keep the balance in the garden. So I don't mind that in my compost, around the compost edges, I know I've got mice, but my dogs also know I've got mice around it. So they help keep it under control as well. But building a place, the apartment complex out of logs and branches, great idea. Our hen house, hello to you. Question, in 2 raised beds I have, one had a lot of slug damage and root crop damage, the other nothing. Anything I should do to the one with a history of pest now? So I would start by trying to do a quick analysis. If you've got 2 beds and one had issues and one didn't, try to determine what the difference is that may have led to the slug damage and the root damage. If you can figure that out, then that answers your question. The height of a bed, for instance. So if one of the beds is higher and that's the one that doesn't have the damage, then maybe consider adding an extension to the raised bed that did have the damage. If you mulched differently, if you have different path material around the edges, consider those kind of things. If you turned one of the beds but didn't turn one of the other beds, that could be an issue. So do that kind of analysis. And in identifying the pest, particularly if you've got root damage, that implies that it's one of those pests that is burrowing into the ground, and the larva is probably eating the roots and causing that damage. So part of the analysis is what plants were growing in those beds. So if they were the exact plants in both beds, the same plants, you look at the structure of the bed to see if maybe that was an influence. If there were different plants in the beds, look at that as an aspect because insects are very plant specific. The reason squash bugs are called squash bugs is because they'll typically do more damage to squash plants than they will to apple trees. So, by understanding the pests you have, it happened again. Are we still live? Oh, I'm back. Doesn't look like I'm on. I'm going to Okay, I'm going to keep talking. It doesn't look like my camera is working. I'm not sure if the sound is working. If you can hear me, let me know. And okay, the picture is frozen. So I'm going to exit momentarily and then I'm going to come back in and let's see if this works. So hopefully I'll be able to get back in. But I don't see my picture. Oh, there I go. I don't know what's going on. I'm going to have to do some analytics of my own with my camera and my computer when this is all done. So I do apologize again. This is one of those things that typically happens. So anyway, just to finish up that previous thought, the idea is to look at what's different in two beds if you've got a pest in one and don't have a pest in the other. And you might discover that it's the plants that are attracting that particular pest. In this case, it's slugs. So if the slug is attacking one particular bed, then do some slug traps and maybe start doing some variation in the garden. That's where crop rotation comes in, where you start moving around the plants from bed to bed to help deter and confuse some of those pests like slugs. For the root damage, where it's a burrowing pest, same idea. Crop rotation by planting different plants in different beds might also be able to help eliminate some of those issues. Sherry's saying that's what Gardner got kids for sitting outside in the snow in a flannel shirt. Yeah, I wonder if it's related to the weather. It doesn't look like I've lost any of my internet signal, but it's hard to say. And yes, this is definitely flannel time of year. And I was outside this morning in the snow. Let's go ahead and I'll talk about some of the things as I look about the picture behind me to give you an idea of some of the things that I still have to do in my garden and how I look at cleanup in general. So in the background, you can see the tall plants I have. And off to this side, most of those plants have fallen down either from the snow or the dogs. Those are my asparagus plants. And so the wind I get in winter can be quite extreme. And if I leave my asparagus plants up, that puts a lot of strain on the roots because those tall asparagus plants are swaying back and forth and it's affecting the roots. So I need to cut all those back. Now, I can do chop and drop. I can cut those tall stalks of my asparagus and let them become mulch on top of those beds. And that's what I typically will do with those plants. When you look to these beds that anchor my arch, I have strawberries in there. And I get asked that question a lot about cleaning up strawberries, about mulching strawberries going into the winter. That's a plant that I don't clean up. I actually allow the strawberry leaves that will brown and die once the cold weather comes. I'll leave them on the plant because when I get days like this with the snow, that snow collects on those leaves and becomes an insulator. Snow has a relatively constant temperature of freezing. And so the plants, particularly the crown of a strawberry plant, if it's exposed to very cold temperatures, it can damage the plant. But those leaves act as extra insulation over the crown. And then any snow that falls on those leaves helps keep a consistent temperature right around freezing. And strawberries can handle a temperature of freezing. So there are some plants that I'm cleaning up and some plants I'm not cleaning up. If you look at this pollinator garden that's directly behind me, and you can see lots of seed heads that are still on the plants, I'm leaving up all of those plants throughout the winter so that the birds can find those seeds. Come springtime, the seeds are gone. So I've got very little concern about weeds popping up, or I should say the volunteers popping up and becoming weedy, because the birds have taken care of most of that. The flowers that I want to propagate, the ones that I want to spread out this space, I've already done those seeds. I've already collected some of those seed heads. I've already spread that seed around, and now everything else stays in place primarily for the birds. If you look at like this little fountain that I had a video that showed how I constructed that, Lika was nice enough to already pull the pump out of that fountain. But that's one of those things that you have to start looking at. I'm leaving it in place without the fountain because leaving the fountain in place over the winter, at least in my winter, it's going to freeze, it's going to damage it. But I do want a water source for my animals. So I'm leaving that fountain in place, and I go out periodically and add some water to it so that the birds in particular, and my dogs as well, because they're out playing and they will drink from that fountain. They've got something to drink from. And so in the past, I've cleaned up most of my fountains and put all the components away for the winter. But having a source for the wildlife of water can be really important, especially during the cold winter months when everything is frozen. You might have to go out and crack the ice and add some fresh water. Do that. It really can make a difference over the course of the year. And Dan is saying, I have to empty my fountain before nightly freezing temperatures. Yeah, add that to your list of things that you need to take care of as part of your cleanup. So I've been talking the plants. It's also the pots and the structures and everything else that will involve the cleanup. Brian's Garden says, I leave a lot of flower heads for the birds, but I'm also using flower heads this year as an addition to my worm chow. Interesting. So got to figure out that balance of whether the worms get it or whether the birds get it. But I love that you're reusing it and helping to feed some of the life in your garden. Mobius 981 is saying, I do add fresh water to bird baths, but the fountains are stored. There you go. As long as you're putting water out there, it doesn't have to be the fountain. For me, this is just an easy solution. That's what I've done in the past is have a bowl with water in it sometimes, as simple as that. It really doesn't take much. It's just the idea that you've got to take care of that wildlife. The storage for your pots, if you are pouring out the soil from your pots, either adding it to your beds or maybe putting it in a bucket or a garbage can, and you store your pots, that's all part of cleanup. Your pots will last longer if you store them away for half the year, particularly the harshest half of the year. So consider that as part of your cleanup, actually putting some of the materials that you grow in into a shed or a garage. Mobius 981 says, I do have a winterizing list that I follow every October. Lots of details to garden cleanup. Great suggestion. Yes, this comes with experience. You start figuring out what you need to do, when you need to do it, and make a list and add it to your gardening calendar of activities that you're going to do. In October and November, I have those regular activities. November typically is the month that I'm getting out and amending my beds and mulching my beds and getting them put to rest for the winter. And so this November was really not much different than last November and the November before. Sometimes it happens with October, depending on the plants. October is generally the time of year that I'm planting my garlic. And so the bulbs that we put into the garden can also be part of the garden cleanup. You pull out the plants, you add some amendments, and then you plant your bulbs as just another step of your typical gardening activities. And if you have that on a set schedule and you do it from year to year, it really makes it easier. And it helps ensure that you accomplish all those steps, especially if you have a list to do it. EMKN, MKIN, I'll guess is what it is. Does one type of bed material harbor more pests than another? I haven't noticed that a bed type, so a wood bed, a metal bed, a plastic bed, a stone bed, the material of the bed itself, I don't think really plays much difference in the pest you have. It really comes down to the soil. And so you might have different soils in different bed types. I know I do as I build different beds, like my stone beds are more of a permanent bed, and I'll be growing perennials in the stone beds that I just built. And so I have more native soil in those beds so that I don't have to worry about the settling of the soil as much. And the soil inside that bed more closely matches the soil around it outside the bed. My vegetable garden beds have much more organic matter because I'm growing the vegetables versus the perennials. So if there's a difference in the soil type, then yes, that could influence the pests because many pests are drawn to those soils that have more organic matter in it. But a bed that has more native soil in it might attract some of your native pests that are burrowing into the soil outside your beds. So I would think the soil is probably more of a factor than the material of the bed. I don't think I've ever seen a paper or research or anything that would suggest the bed material would affect the pest within it. So if anyone has any other information on that, by all means, let us know. But I think it's the soil and the compost and the mulch that really would play a much bigger factor in whether you have pests or what type of pests you have, or whether you can eliminate the pests by dealing with the turning of the soil and bringing up all that larva. And I like to do that in spring. So one of the reasons that I'll do a spring amending or a spring turning of the soil is if I suspect there might be a pest issue. In the fall, when those eggs are first laid, you might not even know that the pests are there. But come springtime, you can see the larva. You can see the grubs that are in the soil. And so by turning the soil in the spring, you now have a great food source for chickens and birds. I love turning over the soil, pulling out all those grubs, and then tossing them to the chickens next door. So when we clean up the garden and deciding when is the best time, that plays into it. It's easy to see some of those pests like the grubs, the larvae of the different beetles, and eliminate them in the spring. And you might have more success in eliminating or at least greatly reducing some of those pests, depending on when you decide to take those actions. Serena's asking, I found a hole on the opposite end of my butterbush squash from the stem. It's a bush plant that makes smaller butternut squash. I put it in the compost. Should I remove it? Probably not. The nice thing about the compost is if you've got some pest that burrowed into your squash, and the reason you added the squash to your compost is because you suspect there's an insect inside of it, I would consider cutting up the squash because that will help expose any insects inside as well, and they're more likely to die once they're exposed. But as that squash breaks down in your compost pile, you don't need to really worry about it at all. Anything that would have been inside that squash is now going to be extra food for the bacteria in your compost pile. So uh, I I got no problem whatsoever. In fact, I actually like the idea of adding some of those materials to your compost pile. Apples, for instance, if I see the holes in my apples and suspect that maybe there were some eggs that were laid in it, yeah, I'm adding those apples to my compost pile because that's going to almost always eliminate those eggs through the composting process. So take that into account when you're putting things into the compost pile. If you throw those fruits away, it might not kill the insect. And now it goes to a landfill and then they hatch and now you've got a whole new population. If you can eliminate them in your own garden space, I say go for it. Mobius is asking, can you give us some tips about cleaning, storing garden implements and tools? Oh yeah, absolutely. Good question. And so the cleaning of the tools in fall, early winter is a great idea. The weather, at least in my area, tends to get pretty dry over the winter. We have really low humidity, but when it snows, when the snow melts, when the rains come, either in fall or winter, the humidity rises. And so dirty tools are more likely to rust, particularly when exposed to an increase in humidity. So, cleaning your pruning shears, cleaning your spades, cleaning your hose, anything that is made of metal, if you can at least brush off all of that dried soil on those tools, do it. The cutting surfaces, like for the loppers and the secateurs, go ahead and clean those sharp blades. Get all of that plant residue, all the sap, clear all of that off of those tools. That will help reduce rust. And then just to make it a little bit extra protection, oil them. Go ahead and use like a mineral oil, or you can even use vegetable oil. I don't like using vegetable oil because it tends to get a little bit gummy. But consider putting some type of oil on your tools, your metal tools, as protection going into the winter months. And then come springtime, everything's clean. You just pull them out and you just start using again. The storing of the tools is the same basic idea. Now, I'm a relatively lazy gardener, so over the course of the growing season, I'll just lean my tools in against the wall in the shed or against the wall in my garage because I'm constantly grabbing one of my shovels and using it in the garden, or I'm going to grab the hoe. And so I just lean it, use it, lean it, use it. That's really not a good idea either. Go ahead and hang your tools to get them off the ground, to get them away from any of that dirt and moisture that they might be exposed to. And I have recently rediscovered, seem to discover this every year, but when you start storing your tools in an orderly manner, you may discover that you've got tools that you forgot you had. When I started cleaning up my garage and putting the tools away, I'd forgotten that I had some of these tools. I thought I had lost one of my hose. I thought maybe I'd given it away. Maybe I'd let somebody borrow it. It wasn't until I started cleaning up and putting my tools away that I rediscovered the hoe in a different garage, in a different storage space, because I just gotten out of the habit of putting the tools away because I just used them all the time. And so I had used the hoe in my front yard and I'd forgotten that I used it. And so I had leaned it against the inside wall. And it wasn't until I started cleaning up my garage that I found the tool. So that to me is one of the biggest tips when it comes to storing your tools, is doing it in an orderly manner to see if there's something missing. And I also discovered this recently as far as a trowel that I loved using. And as I was putting everything away, it's like the trowel's missing. What happened to the trowel? And so I had to search through my mind. When did I use it last? Where would it be? And I had left it sitting in one of my beds. And it wasn't a vegetable bed that I'm constantly working in and now getting ready for winter. No, it was one of my other beds where I was doing some planting of bulbs and using that trowel to plant the bulbs. And then I just laid it on the ground. I don't know if the phone rang or the dogs were barking, but whatever happened, the trowel got left outside. And it wasn't until I started putting everything away that I realized it was missing, and I went to look for it. So cleaning the tools, of course, will help them last longer, and then storing them in a nice orderly way will also help ensure that you don't leave them outside over the winter and then find them all rusted and the handle all cracked from the elements of the weather. That can really make a difference. Prayer Warrior says, in Massachusetts, can't garden, but to satisfy my need, I was making hydroponic bins with fish pumps. But this year I bought a tower. Good for you. Hydroponics is a lot of fun in the winter months when you can't get out and do some of the things that you would otherwise be doing. So I'm glad that you were able to fill that need. I am just about ready to get my hydroponic setup going. I wasn't growing anything in it during the summer months. And now that I'm mostly cleaned up with my fall cleanup, I'll be setting my hydroponics up to start growing salad greens and things like that that are so fun to grow indoors in the winter months. So if you haven't thought about hydroponics, think about it. I've got a couple of videos on hydroponics that might help out in that arena to help you get started. Sherry says, I use linseed oil. Yeah, good suggestion. For my art supplies to oil my metal tools, makes a big difference and smells great. Yeah, in fact, just a couple months ago, I bought a gallon of linseed oil. That's great for the handles of the tool. So if you've got a tool that has a wooden handle and the metal blade or the tip, linseed oil, you can do both the handle and the cutting edge of a tool. So great thing to add to your tool bag is some linseed oil. Oh, yep, there's Mobius 981 says linseed oil on the wood handles. Tim K says, here in Cincinnati, my pepper plants and tomatoes are still growing outdoors in the ground. Good for you. Wild. Not sure if it has always been this way here. So start keeping track of that. That's one of those things when I say find out what is happening and start tracking it from year to year, because especially next year, if it happens again, you're establishing a baseline of how long you can keep your pepper plants and your tomatoes growing. I had a little celebration I went to over the weekend and was talking to one of my friends who happens to be a gardener. And we were talking about pepper plants in particular. I was asking about his harvest, and because he'd showed me around his garden a few months back. And both of us essentially did the same thing. The weather was changing. It was getting colder. We just figured the tomatoes were done. A lot of the other plants were done, but our peppers were still producing much later into the year than is typical. And so both of us ended up covering the beds that we had our peppers in so that we could extend the pepper season. And it worked great. It definitely worked great for me. I talked about that in my paprika making video. So for Tim in Cincinnati, start considering that. You may still get even a longer season if you consider covering those beds when the cold weather does arrive, assuming you've still got fruit on the plant and you want to get a little more maturity in those peppers. Cover them to protect from the cold. And an extra week, an extra 2 weeks can make a big difference when it comes to the crops, like the peppers. The red pepper tastes better than the green pepper, and if you can get it to that ripe stage, go for it. DLR 978 says, I'm going to be the devil's advocate. If cleaning, sharpening your tools costs more in time and labor than the price of the tool, maybe think of purchasing a new tool. That's a good point. If you have the throwaway tools, basically the cheap stuff, then yeah, I've had cheap tools that I just use until they break and then I toss them. I encourage, and we were talking recently about gifts for gardeners. I encourage, whether you buy a gardening gift for yourself, or if you ask someone for a gardening gift, get the quality tool. If you can get a quality tool, they can last for years. And then it is worth the time and expense to clean and sharpen and oil. Totally up to you. If the tools are throwaway tools, then yeah, why waste the effort if they're already? I had a trowel that I'd had for many years, and the handle, it had been left out. The handle started cracking, and that was one of those. Even though I love that tool, with the cracked handle, it just wasn't as good anymore. I stopped worrying about it. I stopped making the effort with that trowel, and now it's stuck in some back corner somewhere. And I got a better trowel that's going to last longer. That doesn't have a wooden handle. It has a synthetic handle, and it's doing great. So you've got to be the one to decide what too much effort is, and then decide whether you're going to make that effort or not. Wasabi Gal says, I use Pam, a cooking spray, does a great job on tools, and I use olive oil on my rubber boots. Works great. Good for you. And that's one of those. If you find something that works and is easy, keep doing it. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, I know I'm a little bit behind in the comments. I'm going to scroll down and try to catch up a little bit. There's Jay with a link to my fall garden checklist, important gardening tasks. Thank you for that, Jay. Yeah, I've been doing this long enough, both the gardening and the making of videos, that I have more than one fall video that talks about some of the things that you can do in your garden to really help out. This is a good tip from John C. I have a shadow board for all my tools and always put them back in the right place. Also, if you leave something out, you notice as its space is empty. There you go. Part of that organization with your tools so that you can figure out what is there and what isn't there. Big Will Dog 82 in the soil. You've added to your name. I just learned a valuable lesson about the age of seeds and their viability. Now I take a handful and try to sprout them. So good for you. Yeah, I think we talked about that a week or two ago when I was talking about seeds and saying when you go through your seeds, you may find that the 95% plus viability that is what a new package of seeds should have. It may be less than that. And so a package of seeds that's 2, 3, 4, 5 years old may not give you complete germination, but there's still some viable seeds there, most likely. And do that, grab a handful and try to sprout them. Or just grab the handful and throw it out into the landscape and see what sprouts in springtime. But you don't have to throw away seeds. I don't know if I've ever thrown away seeds. Even the seeds that get to the point that they may not be viable at all, I'm still throwing outside for birds and insects to eat. So reuse those seeds in any way possible. And so let us know what happens with the sprouting, because this also adds to your gardening knowledge and experience. Is carrot seeds, for instance. Carrot seeds, when you look at all the lists, say will last for 3 years. That doesn't mean at 3 years that you got to throw away your carrot seeds. In year 4, take a handful of carrot seeds and see what happens. I've sprouted carrot seeds that were 5 years old, even though all of the recommendations say 3 years for carrot seeds. Well, I think I might have only got 30 or 40% germination on those seeds, but it still showed that there was viability of the seeds even past the supposed expiration date. So if you journal, and I suggest that you do, keep track of those kind of things so that when you discover a box of seeds that you didn't know you had and you start looking at the dates, you can check your own information to find out whether you think those seeds are still going to be good or not, and use them. They'll still grow in many cases. Growing with Donnie. Good morning to you. I'm also working on getting my hydroponics set up and some microgreens microgreens. Awesome. Microgreens are another one of those cool things. They grow so quickly, and you can use them in so many different ways, in drinks and smoothies, or in salads. Go for it. That's a nice wintertime activity when you're looking for some of those gardening things to do indoors. The hydroponics, the microgreens, absolutely. I think those are wonderful ideas to keep going. There's Jay on one of my videos, growing hydroponic vegetables. Thank you for that, Jay. Sherry is saying, my garage is insulated and sheetrocked, and the big 18-foot wide door is windows. Wow, I've kept pepper plants throughout the winter, often until the snake moved in. It keeps the mice down, but knocks things over. That's funny. I'm glad that you're keeping the mice away, but that must be a relatively big snake if it's knocking things over. So keep gardening. If you've got a space like that, go for it. I think that sounds like a wonderful gardening space. Carla is saying, those nasturtiums in the bed along the house are still growing up against the wall at the back of the bed, even though most of the plant died back because of the freezing nights. That's another thing to start keeping track of. The plant's peppers fall into this category. Many people think peppers are going to die in the first freeze, and that's not the case. The leaves might die back, but pepper plants are actually a quite durable plant and can survive some freezing conditions. Nasturtiums, add them to the list. There are a lot of plants that can keep growing even after they get a freeze. And so learning what needs to be protected, what doesn't need to be protected when we are cleaning out our beds, knowing whether it's dead or whether it will come back if the weather improves, becomes an important factor in deciding what plants you're going to pull. And so that's another component. So as I've been cleaning up my tomato beds in particular, do you pull the plant or do you cut the plant when you're doing your garden cleanup? And generally, I think it depends on the plant. So the plants that have very small roots and that I think will decompose and add food to the garden soil, those are the ones I cut off. And then I'll add the leaves to the compost pile. And so as my lettuces die, generally the lettuce root might be a bigger root, but it's a fleshy root, so it breaks down pretty easily. So I'll cut off any of those lettuce heads that were damaged by freezing conditions. I'll throw the leaves in the compost pile. I'll leave the roots in the ground to decompose and help enrich the soil. When it comes to the tomato plants, generally, I will pull the tomato plant roots before I plant again. But for my fall cleanup, I'm just cutting the plants and I'm leaving those roots in the ground. And this is one of those things when I say observe, take notes, get that experience. I noticed a few years ago that when I was pulling out some of those roots that inadvertently, sometimes on purpose, were left in the ground in early spring, as the soil was starting to thaw out, there were earthworms in those roots. And so the roots in the soil play a huge role in the health of your soil. And by keeping those roots in place over the course of the winter, you can really be benefiting the soil life. Now, the big woody tomato roots, I'll pull in spring generally when I'm putting in other plants that those roots could interfere with. But if the roots aren't in the way, I leave them in place because it benefits the soil and it benefits the soil life. So keep that in mind when you're making a decision of cleaning up the garden. And then it also gets back to the pests because yes, the earthworms are going to shelter within those roots over the course of the winter, but some of the larvae will too. So don't leave the roots of squash plants, for instance. I'll pull all the squash plants just to help reduce the likelihood of a squash bug problem or any of those other pests that might actually overwinter in some of the plant material that if I left it in place could create a problem. And it's easier in many cases to just go ahead and cut off the stalk and then throw it in the compost pile than it is to have to deal with all those roots. Leave the roots in place if you've found out that it's really not going to benefit some of those pests and some of those bad bugs. Bowtie Life in the Garden, good to see you here. The only place I will ever throw seeds is into dirt, no matter how old. I've discarded 22-year-old seeds that still grew. There you go. That's my basic philosophy as well. That's why I say don't throw away the seeds, throw them in the garden. And even if it's a plant that you don't want growing in that space in the garden, what I was just talking about plays a role. Anytime a plant is growing in the ground, it's benefiting the soil. And so some of those plants that you just, or those seeds that you just throw and they turn into plants, and then it pops up and you go, oh, I really don't want the tomato plant right in the middle of my azaleas. Then yeah, at that point you can cut down the tomato plant. But all during the process of that seed germinating and those roots growing, your soil was being improved. And it's all about the soil. The more you can benefit the soil, the better your plants are going to grow. Betty Barnes says, I found seeds while packing house to move. The onion seeds were 4 years old. I threw them in a pot and they're popping up. Everyone says they're only good for a year. There you go. Perfect example. And yes, I've said that before too. When asked how long onion seeds last, that's the recommended answer is 1 year. But I've had seeds at the 3-year point. Usually I've used up the seeds by then. But yeah, I've had onion seeds sprout at 3 years. And now Betty says 4 years. So save your seeds and throw them into the garden. And a fall sowing, I've got a video where I talk about sowing the garden and winter growing and as part of the fall process. That's an easy way to get plants growing in your landscape. Just throw the seeds out there. If it sprouts in spring, chances are it's going to do well in your landscape because the seed determined that the conditions were right and now it's growing in your garden. And I love letting those plants grow because they've already demonstrated that they want to grow in my garden. So yeah, absolutely. I will allow them to grow in my garden. Sherry says, may I suggest a book for apartment dwellers? The Sprout book by Doug Evans. And yes, Sid the snake is about 6 feet long. That's a big snake. I don't know that book, but thank you for suggesting that. The Sprout book by Doug Evans. And so I'm guessing that's all about growing sprouts indoors. So good for you. And Bowtie Life is saying, I have 3-year-old pepper plants that I keep overwintering thanks to your teaching. Cool. Yeah, pepper plants are awesome for overwintering and growing year after year. They will grow for many years if you go through that process. So good for you. I'm glad you're doing that. That's one of those activities that if more gardeners did it, they would recognize that it becomes a regular part of their garden cleanup. So in the pepper bed, when it's time to clean up that bed and get it ready for winter, yeah, dig up the pepper plant and overwinter it. Then with that plant potted up and indoors, you can add your compost and your mulch and the bed is ready for winter. Come springtime, go ahead and put the plant back into one of your beds and you get a head start on the growing season with a mature plant. And the leaves on those mature plants typically grow very quickly and you'll get quicker flowers and quicker fruit. It's a great thing to do. So consider that as an option. So Llama says, I've had multiple 25-degree Fahrenheit nights. That's about -4 Celsius. And I had the same thing with a nasturtium in a green stock. It's the plant that's facing away from incoming wind. So that's probably why. Either way, I'll take it. Yeah, whatever works, take it. Keep the tower of the green stock absolutely will cut wind on that backside. So keep those nasturtiums growing. Oh, I do want to mention, since I just got the email this morning, that the green stock Black Friday sales began today. And so, of course, I've got a link below. But if you've been looking at green stocks, There's some pretty good sales. I think they've got the 5-tier tower on sale for $99. And I believe they got free shipping in the United States. And of course, if you use the Gardener Scott code, you get $10 off. So if you've been waiting for a green stock, this could be the week to do it. The Black Friday sales are starting to pop up. Epic Gardening has added some new stuff to their Black Friday sales. And the Garden in Minutes, the one that I showed in a couple recent videos with that watering grid system, they've got some Black Friday sales that are going on this week. And of course, I've got links to all of that below. But this could be a good week. I've been building you all up to it for the last couple weeks to say, start looking for some of the Black Friday sales. And there's some good ones that are starting to happen right now. So I put a lot of those links and my Gardener Scott code in the comments below if you're looking for some of those garden materials. But the green stock in particular was one that I saw was happening this week. And so do it. The green stock has the green stock company has typically a Mother's Day, a Father's Day, a Memorial Day. Those are big sales, and then a Black Friday sales. And I'm not sure which one is best. I think right now that those Black Friday prices may actually be a little bit less than some of those other big sales that they've already had this year. So check it out if it's something that you are interested in. Shandy's Garden is asking, how do I put the compost pile to bed? I don't want the pest over there, even though I'm a lazy cold composter, or maybe that could be a trap pile. So I just let it go. I don't do much. I keep adding to the pile. So if you are a cold composter or a cool composter or a lazy composter, I have my video on lazy composting. It's just letting it freeze over the course of the winter. And I'll still add to it. So in the spring, there will be fresh material, and I turn it in spring to jumpstart it. But I don't worry too much. Like I mentioned a little while back, I know I've got mice in that pile, and that's all part of nature. And then, of course, my dogs are doing a great job of keeping that mice population down. But I still have mice. I think it was not this last week, but the previous week, 5 out of 6 days, Mala brought in a mouse. I take it back. 4 out of 6 days, Mala brought in a mouse. Lika actually brought in her first mouse a couple of weeks ago. So I know the idea of your dogs bringing mice in the house may not be appealing, but that tells me that they're out there hunting mice. And chances are they're getting them from near the compost pile. If you don't have a dog, if you don't have a cat, yes, it could be a problem. You might need to set some traps if it becomes a problem. But all I do to put it to bed for the winter is just leave it. And then I continue to save my kitchen scraps and dump it on top of the pile. And that's it. That's all I'm doing to my compost pile. By the time winter comes, all that material has frozen over the course of the winter. When it begins to thaw, it's perfect for the compost pile, because if you any of those scraps that are thawing in spring are going to get kind of mushy, which means they're going to break down pretty quickly. So it's a great jumpstart to the pile in the spring when it's finally time to get outside and do something with your compost pile. So a trap pile, sure, absolutely. If you've got rodents, if you've got even insect pests will overwinter in a compost pile if it's not a hot pile. And then come springtime, get it turned, get it warmed up a little bit, and you'll take care of some of those pests because they can't handle that turned pile. They wanted it nice and cool and protected. And by you turning it in spring, you've disrupted their lifestyle and you may have eliminated some of those pests. So yes, it could end up being a trap pile if you look at it from that perspective. The hot compost can still be done in winter. When you're cleaning up your garden, like we began the show with, we were talking about the browns and the greens and how you clean up your beds in fall, and it's a good brown component. If you want to maintain a hot pile, be careful about adding too many browns. If you're adding browns, then it could just really cool your pile dramatically. So if you've got a hot pile already going and you're cleaning up your garden, I would suggest using the material to create a new pile with a blend of greens and browns, and let the first pile continue cooking and continue generating that heat and decomposing. Adding material to a hot pile really can slow down the whole process, and in many cases just stop the decomposition to the point that it will freeze. So it takes a little bit of work to keep the hot pile going in the winter, but it can definitely be done. Lynn Potes says, I recycle all of my tall stalks for structure the next year. I grew Titan and Mongolian giant sunflowers this year. Look forward to a natural arch next year. Great idea. I love that. So I've talked about making piles of branches for the wildlife, and by all means, make piles of some of those things that you're planning on using again in the garden. I have used the giant sunflower stalks as trellises for vining flowers. I've even used them for trellises of my tomato plants. And so come winter, I'll have a stack of those sunflower stalks. Some of them can be very big, very hard, very sturdy. And I love that idea. The arch, yeah, making a natural arch with some of your sunflowers, go for it. I think that's a wonderful idea. Great suggestion. And it's part of the cleanup. It's one of those things that whether you throw it in a compost pile, whether you make a chaotic blend for the wildlife, or whether you stack it neatly to be used next year, I'm one of those gardeners that likes to save as much as I can going into the next year so that I don't lose out on something. Shandy's Garden says, I've got many volunteers on the compost pile, but do you think we should be turning our lazy cold compost or using those as trap plants? I want to do what's best for winter. Either, depending on how cold your winters get, those plants are probably going to be frozen and die and be extra composted material going into the next year. If they're the kind of plants that could be trap plants, then yeah, now you know that whatever it is you're trying to trap is localized to your compost pile. Whether you turn it or not, totally up to you. Part of the idea of a lazy cold compost is that you really don't need to turn it. That being said, I did turn my compost pile a couple weeks ago because I was just adding so much to it. And I knew the bottom half had already started breaking down. And so I turned it one last time just to kind of blend everything together going into the winter. So deciding when that final turn of your compost pile is when you're doing a cool composting method is totally up to you. But before everything freezes solid, that's a good time to do it. Once you get out there, and at least in my area, the pile still has moisture in it. It's got all those ingredients, but once it gets cold for a sustained period of time, the pile freezes and there is no turning. So if you are at all thinking about turning it, which is not a bad thing, then go out and turn it, and just recognize that some of those plants are not going to survive the turning process. So which is more important, turning or using the trap method to isolate some of those insects as you move forward. So there's Jay. Yeah, the green stock, using the code, the link there. Appreciate that, Jay. I've got 4 green stocks. I'm tempted to get a 5th one. I'm really trying to cut back on some of my gardening purchases, but I'm thinking about it. Julie Pooley's asking, do you leave drip irrigation outside on raised beds over the winter in Iowa 6B? I generally remove all of my drip irrigation, all my soaker hoses, and I store them away in the shed. I'm in 5B, so I get down to about -15 Fahrenheit, that's -26 Celsius. and you're getting down to -5 Fahrenheit, about -21 Celsius. And that's cold enough to damage if there's any water left in those systems. So the emitters, the drip emitters, there's usually some water left inside. And some of those tubes, even though they might be a poly tube, and so they've got some give, they might stretch a little bit. The hard plastic that is used to join the tubes together, that can be damaged in the severe cold in freezing conditions. So generally, I remove all of those drip irrigation components, store them away after I've drained them the best I can, but store them in a dry shed, and then bring them out in the springtime. The new system I have, the Garden in Minutes system that I was just talking about, that I got a link to, they say that you can leave them in place over the winter. And so this is the first winter that I've got that system. I'm leaving it in place as a test. And next year I'll get it fired up and see if I've got any leaks or any problems. It has a poly tube that looks like it's quite durable, and they say you can leave it in place. So I'm going to leave it in place. So the manufacturer of your system may have a recommendation, but generally for the drip emitters, I put them in place. And I do the same thing with my watering wand. I found out the hard way. Can't tell you how many watering wands I've lost, the type that have that rainfall tip. So it's a nice light, even watering through the wand. All it takes is one time that those are left out or exposed to freezing conditions, and the metal that actually has all the holes in it, that is so susceptible to freezing damage and will bend and break. It won't break, it'll bend, it'll actually separate from that head, and you can't put it back. It just doesn't work right. So anything that has water in it, and as it freezes, that water expands, and if there's nowhere for that expansion to go, it's going to damage the tool. So I learned too late in my gardening career to put away a lot of those tools as soon as you don't use them on a regular basis, and as soon as it looks like some of those freezing conditions are coming. You'll be able to use those tools much longer if you take advantage of that and take care of your tools by storing them away. And it's important, because I don't like having to buy new watering wands every year because I had forgotten to pull them up and put them into the shed. So I prefer to reuse as much as possible. Okay, let's see. Bettina says, good afternoon to you all. Good afternoon to you. And always nice to see you here. So yeah, Julie Pooley says, I have good storage place. And I'll check the watering in minutes link too. Cool. Thanks for that. Sherry says, I love the rainfall wands, but they're so frail. Yeah, if that tip gets damaged, that head, it's all over. So protect it as much as you can. Yankee Sister Homestead, it's always wonderful having you here. Thanks for that. So thankful for you, Gardener Scott, and each and every one in your lives. May love abound on this upcoming holiday. Serve your produce with pride. Thank you for that, and I do appreciate the contribution to help support the channel. I hope you have a fantastic holiday season in Connecticut as your days start stacking up towards the end of the year. I know we're all looking to next year, but I hope you have a wonderful holidays of your own. For those of you who are celebrating Thanksgiving here in the US in this upcoming week, yeah, I hope you all have a fantastic holiday season, and Thanksgiving is just a few days away. My kids and grandkids are coming for Thanksgiving, so I'll be hosting them. That's fantastic. I've got some peppers that I have fermented. I'll be using them in one of the appetizers I'll be making. And I still have some zucchini. I have some winter squash that I'm planning to make as one of the sides. So using your own produce, even into the winter months, That's why I say start doing the analysis of your gardening season, and especially when you hear me talk about it and others talk about it. If you didn't grow winter squash this year, add it to your list for next year, because it's fantastic to pull out a butternut squash going into the cold winter months and then making butternut squash soup. I love making my own butternut squash soup with my own butternut squash. If you haven't done that, add it to your plan, something to start thinking about. And Sherry's saying, I'm making my vegan roast and a lot of traditional sides for the holiday. Love it. Yeah, if you're doing a lot of the vegan and vegetarian cooking, growing your own stuff just makes so much sense. Lynn Potes is saying, OMG, I'm so addicted to the fermented pepper thing. Validation. Sweet. Yeah, you're validated. I've done a whole bunch of different types. So I grew the Mad Hatter pepper this year, which is kind of a dome-shaped pepper. And I left those whole. I cut little slits when I put them into the jar to ferment. And so it's like eating a pepperoncini, which I've also done before too. So you can grab the little stem and eat it. That's what I did with my Mad Hatter peppers this year. And it was great. A lot of the other peppers, I just cut into slices and then I fermented that way. And they're ready to be pulled out as sliced pickled peppers to be used in whatever I want to use them in. So consider yourself validated. It's definitely one of those things to add to your list. Tony, great to see you here. Hey, all, sorry I'm late, got caught up in traffic because of the weather. So I guess Tony's been having some bad weather in Wales. And I've got more snow on the way Wednesday here. So this surprise snowstorm that I had today, I got more coming on Wednesday. So who knows what it's going to look like. I did want to point out before I forget. So this is a mistake. These are one of those things that I don't always do right. And so in the background here, I have my wheelbarrow because the weather has been good enough to use my wheelbarrow to cart back and forth some of those things that I was moving to the compost pile, also moving some soil around. I didn't know this snowstorm was coming today, and I had left my wheelbarrow out exposed to the conditions. That wheelbarrow has done me well for at least 25 years now, if not more. The handle is cracked. It's getting a little rusty, but I keep it clean as much as possible. And I try to rub out those rust developments as early as possible. And that's why I'm still using the same wheelbarrow after a couple years or a couple decades. Even when it gets exposed to weather like this, I add that to my cleanup list. Add it to the things I got to do when I get outside with the warming weather, is tend to my wheelbarrow, along with all those other tools that we already talked about. So some of it's learning the hard way. The forecasts, I try to stay up with the forecast, but it's not always accurate. Sometimes it's wrong. If you leave a tool out, deal with it. Fix it, oil it, sharpen it, whatever you got to do so that you can keep using it. Rick is asking now, what is the weather station? What is the weather station is for? That's what the weather station is for. Yes. And so I love my Tempest weather station. In fact, they're having a sale right now, I believe, too. I put them in the link below. And so I love my Tempest weather station. Daily, I'm looking at the Tempest forecast, but the difference is my weather changes so quickly that I need to do it more than once a day. And yesterday I looked at the Tempest with a focus on Wednesday because my stepdaughter's coming down from northern Colorado and going to be traveling, and I was concerned about her. And I wasn't concerned about my own garden today. I was looking at the forecast for Wednesday and Thursday for Thanksgiving. So yeah, that is exactly what the weather station is for. You just have to figure out how you're going to use it. And I'm normally using it for today and tomorrow. And I forgot to look at tomorrow yesterday, but that happens. Live and learn. Those things happen, and we do what we can to deal with them the best that we can. Sherry says, I like my ambient weather station and online Ryan Hull, y'all on YouTube. He's always on top of things. So good to know. Thank you for that. There's Jay with the Tempest Weather Station and the discount code if you use that link and code. So thank you for that, Jay. Yeah, the Black Friday sales that are coming up, I tried really hard through the month of November in particular, not getting anything on Amazon, really cutting back on my typical purchases so that I could take advantage of some of those Black Friday sales. And so what I mentioned, I think last week, I went ahead and on the 21st, got a new microphone set up that you'll see in future videos. It's amazing. I love it. And I may even talk about it in a future video because now my microphone has a little button on it. And so I can get all framed up, ready to start the shot, push that button, and it will start filming. In the past, I've had to stand at the camera, push the button, walk into the frame, start the filming, come back. And so you can imagine with the editing, I edit out a lot of footage from my videos because of all the walking back and forth from the camera to wherever it is that I'm being filmed. Now, my microphone actually allows me to push a button and start and stop that process. Crazy, this technology that is developing. I took advantage of a Black Friday sale and saved, I think, 30% on that microphone. So score, I was ready for it. And I definitely jumped on top of that. So that's kind of how I suggest as you go into your Black Friday sales, if it's something you've been waiting for, look for a sale. And especially if you can use the Gardner Scott code for an extra discount, that's a bonus all the way around. So consider that in these next couple of days. It used to be only on Friday they have these sales, but now so many companies like the Green Stock and the Garden in Minutes, they start their sales before Black Friday even arrives. And so now it's kind of like Black Friday week for a lot of these activities. So think about your tools. We're talking about the garden cleanup tools, the tools in the shed, the organized system. Yeah, if you're missing something, this might be a good time to pick up some of that stuff. Shandy's Garden says, I thought there was a phone app for the Tempest station. There is. Ryan Hall, y'all talks about it all the time, monitors everything. Oh, yeah. Yeah, when I'm checking my weather, it's on my phone. And so my Tempest links to my phone and the Tempest network. You can join the network of all the Tempest weather stations near you. The thing I like about the Tempest is it also links to the National Weather Service. And so when it does a forecast, it'll use the European model. It'll use the American model. So the forecasts tend to be much better on the Tempest. And I do that all from my phone. Absolutely. That's a big reason why I like it. You just have to be looking in the right place at the right time and look at Monday before Monday arrives instead of looking at Wednesday before Monday arrived. That's my only issue. So it wasn't that big deal. Sherry says, I have a lavalier mic I'm hoping to make friends with. Approaching doing a YouTube channel of my own on ornery aging. Well, good for you, Sherry. When that happens, let us know. You know, I like to support smaller channels. So when you start making those videos, let us know and we'll definitely go and see what you have to say about ornery aging. I don't like to think of myself as ornery, though others occasionally might say that's what my aging brings. But it's always good to see a viewpoint and a new channel, especially from someone in this wonderful community. If you are traveling for Thanksgiving, I hope that you have safe travels. If people are traveling to you, I hope they have safe travels. One of the things about the Thanksgiving holiday is that we take some time out of our busy schedules to actually give thanks for those things we appreciate in life. Every week I give thanks to all of you. This is nothing new, but if you don't do that on a regular basis, like me, if you don't have the opportunity every Monday to thank all those people who mean so much to you, then when you get together on Thanksgiving, try to take that opportunity to give thanks for what you have, who you have in your life, all of those things. We all have something that we can give thanks for. And this is just one of those holidays here in the United States that is kind of set up to do that. So I suggest doing that and getting out there. Heidi says, thank you all for being here today. Everyone have a safe and fabulous Thanksgiving in the US. Lots to be thankful for. Also have a fabulous week. And so Heidi's a perfect example, I think, of saying, yes, we all have something to be thankful for, even when things aren't going right in our life and other things aren't what we would want them to be. There's always something that we can benefit from by just acknowledging it. So thank you to all of you for all of your wonderful support and attention and the camaraderie in making this community such an amazing place. Have a fantastic Thanksgiving. And even if you don't live in a country that celebrates Thanksgiving as a national holiday like we do, you can still use this week to do that. Still use this week to just say, I'm a gardener. I'm thankful that we've got this community that we can share ideas, ask questions, answer questions, and everything associated with it. I think it's so wonderful. I'm going to be back next Monday. That's probably not a surprise. So I hope to see you then. Have a fantastic gardening week and be safe and try to stay warm. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.